Amen. So if you would, if you can get your Bibles out, get your Bibles, and if you will look in the table of contents, and we're going to look for a book entitled Jeremiah.
Preach.
All right. Let's look in Jeremiah 18. And we'll read verses 1 through 6. And I'm going to read from the New King James Version of Jeremiah 18, verses 1 through 6. And it states, "The word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, Arise, get up from where you are, and go down to the potter's house. And there I will cause you to hear my words. Then I went down to the potter's house, and there he was, making something at the potter's wheel. And the vessel that he had made of clay was marred in the hand of the potter. So he made it again into another vessel, as it seemed good to the potter to make. Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, O house of Israel, can I not do with you as this potter, says the Lord? Look, as the clay is in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel." Amen. You may be seated. I wanted to share today from the thought, whose hands are you in? Whose hands are you in? Whose hands are you in? Jeremiah is in the process of developing and growing in his relationship with God at an extremely young age. And in his youthfulness, there is an enormous amount of hesitancy to do what God has called him to do. He feels like there is some deficiencies that exist in his life. He feels like that there is some challenges that exist that precludes him from being able to really do what God has called him to do. And he's limited it based upon what makes sense to him. He is considering his age. He's considering his background. He's considering his knowledge base and the things of life that he's been exposed to. But God has been telling him that in spite of all of those factors that you have come up with that you feel disqualify you from me using you, I want you to realize that I'm not even using you based upon the criteria that you see fit, but it has been based upon my will. I have been in the process of trying to use you from the time that I thought of you. And so he says in Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 4, before I formed you in your mother's belly, I knew you. And this word is an intimate word, meaning I am fully aware of who you are inside and out. He says, before I formed you in your mother's belly, I already knew you. So this is really wonderful to really consider that before my dad and before your father saw your mom, before there was a twinkle in his eye, before he casually walked up to her in all of his effervescence and his smoothness and asked her out for a cup of coffee, or before he got them phone numbers, or before he said anything to her, God said, I already knew you. While you weren't even a thought on your mom's mind, God had already had a plan for you. He was very clear about who he wanted you to be and the family that he would want you to come through the gateway of. He was very clear on how he would fashion your life and how he would make you and where he would want you to reside. Demographically, he was already clear about where he wants you to be. He's also clear about where he would want you to move to. He was very clear from the very beginning, and he says, before I formed you in your mother's belly, I already knew you. Before your mom even realized that she had missed a cycle, before she realized that there were some warning signs happening, before her appetite kicked in and she ate pickles with ice cream, he already knew you. Already knew you. Then he says, while you were in your mother's belly, he says, I sanctified you. While mama carried us and while she was playing and every single day touching her stomach and sizing it up, seeing how much it has expanded, how much it has grown, and looking how her belly button started to look like an Audi and how all of her clothes don't fit anymore. And while she was trying to determine whether or not, and wishing or imagining and daydreaming about whether or not you would be a boy or a girl, before she can come up with your first name and come up with a cute middle name, something that blends with that weird last name that you got, before that she can even go through that process, God says, while your mother's trying to figure out what to name you, I've already figured out what I was going to use you to do. He says, I've already sanctified you. Sanctified does not necessarily mean that I'm a holy roly, but to be sanctified means that I am set apart for sacred use. So before my mother had already identified what my gender was going to be, before they did the planning of the baby shower, before they identified what my name was going to be, God has said, I already set you apart to use you for my glory. So this makes sense that if I understand that I'm already sanctified, that I'm already set apart for sacred use, now it makes sense why I don't get along with everybody. It makes sense now why I can't get along with everybody's clique, everybody's club, even though I try my best to fit in. I try to be a go-along person, but it always seems like I am always going against the current. It seems like they always see something wrong in me. For some reason or another, even if I don't know their name, even if we haven't had a conversation, sometimes people just don't like me for no reason at all. And a part of that is because I've been sanctified. I've been set apart. I've been set apart. Not only did he know me before my mother knew who I was, and before she even knew I was on the way, before they even decided to plan me, I was already sanctified by God. But he says, not only did I sanctify you, not only did I already know you, but I also am using you as a voice for heaven. Little do you realize that even in your most difficult moments, there are times that God uses you and you don't even know you're being used. There's times you give a word of encouragement to somebody, you don't even know that you was encouraging them. There's times that you will say something arbitrarily and you lifted somebody's spirits. And somebody says, you know what, that was confirmation. What do you mean that was confirmation? I wasn't saying anything. Oh, yes, you did. You don't realize that sometimes you are an answer to somebody's prayer. Just because you walked up in the room, you had no idea how God was using you just by showing up. You didn't realize that even when you smiled at somebody, it gave them just enough strength to keep the tears from flowing down their face. Little did you realize that God was using you. He says, I used you as a voice. While you still trying to figure out what your calling is, while you're still trying to figure out what your niche is, while you're still trying to determine what your talents and your gifts are, I had already been in the process of using you. You're really trying to catch up to where I already have you to be. Amen? So in this, he's telling Jeremiah, one of your biggest hurdles is not the fact that I'm going to qualify you to use you in your lifetime. But your biggest challenge is that you can't get past your insecurities. That's your biggest problem, is your insecurities. See, rather than focusing on what you do right and what you do well, all of your attention is always focused on how you miss the mark, things that you cannot do, things that you're not equipped to do, all the opportunities you did not have. And more specifically, when it's time for you to step in front of somebody, you get cold feet. You don't want to say what is really on your heart, what's really on your mind. You're afraid of their opinion. And your fear of their opinion is really based out of your own insecurities, not really based upon how they're going to react, but actually you're really afraid of who you really are. So there is an insecurity that exists, and he tells him in chapter 1, I want you to get to a place that you're not even afraid to even look them eye to eye. That whatever it is I'm telling you to say, I want you to have the courage to say it. And in fact, even when you don't know what to say, I'll put the words running across your head like a teleprompter. I'll let you know what you need to say, when you need to say it, how you need to say it, the tone that you need to use, the cadence that you need to operate in, the voice inflection that you need. I'll tell you what you need to say, when you need to say it. All things don't need to be said, but when the moment is appropriate, I'll tell you what to say. So he takes him through this process of trying to cultivate his life and to grow him. And a part of this process is that he's showing him that, listen, I want to take you somewhere because I've been speaking to you and certain things haven't been clear for you. So what I want to do is take you through this process that you can learn by seeing. And when you see something, I'm going to speak to you based upon what you see. And here's one of the things that we fail to realize is that God is constantly exposing us to truth. God is constantly exposing to us principles about ourselves that always enhance our development and our growth. But most of the time, we miss the move of God. We miss his messages. We miss what he is saying because we're so focused on what's on our agenda. We're so self-centered and self-absorbed that oftentimes we even miss the cues that God gives us. You can find a principle, a kingdom principle, in everything that you see. I mean this literally. Everything that you see, you can find a biblical principle tied into it. I can tell you right now, you are operating in a principle of faith now. Just by sitting here, you're operating in a principle of faith now. Very practical example. Before you sat down, how many of you looked under the chair to see what the capacity weight of that chair is? You came in and you just trusted that the seat, that as skinny as those legs are, that those legs had enough density to hold up your weight. You just believed. In fact, you went on automatic pilot. You didn't test it to see whether or not it would shake. You didn't test it to see if one of the four legs was shorter than the other. You just assumed that there was some equilibrium to that seat, and that when you, not ever so gently, sit in it, but when you took yourself and all of your pounds, that you would just flop down on it. You just believed that the little weights would be enough to sustain you. We operate in principles of faith all the time. But even in looking at this seat, I can learn something. Now, God says to Jeremiah, what I want you to do is go down to the house. When you get to this house, there's a potter's house. When you get there, look in the window, and I'll begin to speak to you based upon what you see. God speaks to us uniquely from things that we see. Here's the challenge, and I don't have time to go into it, but the challenge is sometimes we have a hard time distinguishing our own personal thoughts from the thoughts that God is infusing in our minds. Sometimes I had this challenge where God are you speaking to me on this, or is this just my own thoughts? And this is one of the dichotomies that we have at times because sometimes I'm not really clear. Sometimes I'm not really focused or honed in on when God is speaking. And sometimes I have a hard time distinguishing, and I'm not able to really distinguish at times that it was God speaking until it's in retrospect. So I don't care where you are in your own spiritual development, whether you're a believer or not a believer, we all can say that we all been in this place that when we had to make a decision, when I was unclear about whether that was my own thoughts or whether or not this was God guiding me, it wasn't until retrospect I'm able to see it was God. We'll go through a situation, go through a scenario, and then all of a sudden we would say, something told me not to do that. Something told me not to go there. And so now what I recognize is that those were one of those moments where God was speaking to me. But because I have this inability at times to have the clarity when he's speaking, sometimes I dismiss it as it's just a fleeting thought for myself. But he tells him, I want you to go down to the potter's house. And when you get there, there's something I want you to observe. And when you observe it, that's when I'm going to speak. I want you to be open and have a level of awareness. It is in this awareness you'll be able to start to see how I am moving in your life, but also you'll be able to hear based upon what you see. Now that sounds crazy. I hear better when I can see it. See, give you an example. Sometimes, and I won't say specifically who, but there's a family member of mine, and I can say something, and he or she would say, what? What? I can't hear you. And what they would do is they'll do like this. They'll look at my lips. Say it again.
What? Oh. Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. Right? I see what you're saying. We have said how many times have we said, I see what you I said, yeah, I see what you're saying. And what has happened, it's the same principle. That God is saying, I'll speak to based upon what you are able to observe, and I'll expand your capacity to have more awareness. See, it's when it becomes important to you and it becomes a focus, then you start having awareness to see everything around you that God is doing. Very practical example. What kind of car do you have? A Lincoln. You ain't seen so many Lincolns until you bought one. The minute you buy a Lincoln, there go one. There go one. They just bought, look at all these Lincolns out here. I don't care what kind of car. You can have a Caravan, minivan. You can have, it don't matter what you got, a Saab. You can have a Honda Accord. All of a sudden, you see that car everywhere. Amen. Now, was there an influx of sales for the particular car that you bought? Absolutely not. But what has happened is that because it is important to you, because you have ownership of it, there's a level of awareness that is expanded. Now you see things on the road that you didn't pay attention to before. God is the same way. The moment he becomes your focus, the moment he becomes your priority, you'll be able to see how God was moving the entire time. He didn't just start moving, he's been moving. But because he wasn't a priority, certain things I just kind of dismissed as challenges of life. Things just happened to go awry. But God had been moving the entire time. Right? So there's an awareness that happens when I'm able to focus in and observe what God is doing. And the more I am able to have my awareness expanded, the more I'm able to hear him even better. Because I can see what he's saying. And that makes any kind of sense. Right? I can see what he's saying. So Jeremiah, in his young age, he walks up and he notices the potter going through a selection process. But before he gets to that point, there is 2 main points that God is really trying to drive with Jeremiah. The first point that he's really trying to drive with him is the plan of God, or what some would refer to as the will of God. Jeremiah 29:11 says, "For I know the plans that I have for you, plans to give you hope, peace, and an expected end." There is a desired outcome that I have for you. I have plans to lead to a certain outcome. God says, I have plans for you. Not only did I create you, I didn't just arbitrarily create you and say, you go out there and do your own thing and come talk to me and let me know how it worked out. But God says, when I created you, I set you apart because I had a plan for you, plans to give you hope, peace, and an expected end. There is a desired outcome that I want to have for your life. There is a plan that ultimately leads to the product of your life. There is a plan that exists that ultimately leads to the product of your life. There is a beginning of your life, but there is an expected end that I want to have. There is a final outcome. There's a deliverable that I want to extract from your life. But from the point of your conception and that plan, there is also at the very end of that life, there is that expected end. Everything in between is the process. What we get excited about at times is understanding that there is a plan of God for my life. We like that part. God has a plan for my life. God has a plan for my life. There's a purpose of my life. That's the great part. That's the good news. That's the stuff I can get excited about because it gives me a sense of significance that I'm not just meandering through life, just going every single day, waiting for that good by and by in the sky. But while I'm here on earth, it's good to know that there are some very specific things that he wants to accomplish with my life. Now, I can get excited about even in the course of understanding life that there is a plan. There's also promises and provision that is extended to me to support me in the plan that he has already laid out. So whatever the plan is that exists for my life, intrinsic upon that, sprinkled in there, he gives me provision. In the midst of that, he'll give me prosperity. In the midst of that, he'll make sure I have everything that I need to accomplish the plans that he had for me. So that if I'm supposed to do something, it is his responsibility, it is his shoulder work to ensure he gives me what I need to be successful in what he created me to do. He will supply everything that I need. Now, a part of him supplying my need, intrinsic in that, is the problem with me. Because many of us, and if you've gone to church any length of time, you've heard people say, God shall supply my needs according to his riches in glory. We'll hear that. You hear people say that all the time. But what it does not say, and what it means for them, is God will supply all of my greed according to his riches in glory. We've moved away from the perspective that God supplies needs, not greed. He is not in the business of stroking our flesh and making sure that all you do and all that you have is all about you. It's all tied into purpose. It's all tied into his plan, the plan of God, or the will of God, what he desires for my life. One of the great things that I've really been thinking about this over and over and over again is that in this year, 2018, do you realize in 2018, out of all the centuries that have passed, out of all the years that have elapsed, currently there's almost 7 billion people on the planet. And out of all these billions of people on this planet, do you realize that humanity will only get one shot of experiencing you? One shot. One shot. In the year 2078, there will never be another you that's going to come after you. There was never another you before you. You are an original. There is only one person on this planet like you. And with all of your uniqueness, with you being peculiar, and all of your splendor, as spectacular as you are, you still feel like you ain't enough. You still find a way to complain about what God has created in you. With all of his brilliance of how he shaped you and formed you and put you together. And he said, I had a plan for you. And I've never gave somebody the same plan twice. Everybody has a different course to chart. Everybody has a unique talent. Everybody has a unique giftedness. And out of all of the billions of people on the planet, you are the only one on this planet that possess what you possess. The world only gets one shot at me. Why am I hiding it in the closet? Why am I keeping my voice closed? Why am I not stepping up to the plate? The world only gets one shot of you. Meanwhile, we grew up fantasizing, wishing we could be like somebody else, hoping that my life could evolve to match someone else's life or to aspire to have what they have. Meanwhile, missing the brilliance of what God has put right on the inside of you. There will never be another you. So if you don't release it, the world has a gap because they'll never get another shot at it while you complain about who you are. While we have morphed our lives to emulate or come alongside of or go parallel close to someone else's life that we emulate or we love or we have an affection for, being someone else. And we've said this before, if I spend my life trying to be like somebody else, who will step up and be me? But in his brilliance, he has a plan for your life, the will of God, the plan. But then also, too, there is what we call the process. We can all celebrate the plan, but the part that we have hesitancy is the process. And so from the start to the end, everything in between is the process. And that's the part that makes life difficult because we oftentimes don't understand the process. But the process is geared toward 2 major areas. There are many reasons why the process exists, but 2 major areas. Number 1 is to make sure that my calling is discovered, but 2, for character to be developed. That number 1, for my calling to be discovered, I go through the processes of life so that my calling can be discovered. But 2, the process of what I go through is also for character development. He's developing me. And based upon who I am, the way that I think, my emotional state, the bruises of my heart, me being fractured in my soul, the stuff that I don't want to let go of, the little insecurities that I have, all of the quirks that's about me, the sin nature that I have, the way that I am bent towards a certain temptation, all of those things help dictate and determine the uniqueness of the process that I go through. That's why everybody goes through a different process, because everybody is different. And God fashions the process based upon how you think and how you're going to receive it. And the more you resist the process, the more intense it gets. It was a lot of amens in the beginning part, but when you talk about the process, it's just a few. It's all right. It's all right. It's all right. It's the process, right? It's the process. So in the process of God, here now, Jeremiah discovers the will of God. W-H-E-E-L, the will of God. The plan of God is the will, W-I-L-L. But here he sees the will of God. He notices and observes the potter. The potter is going through the process, number one, of clay selection. He's taking the clay that is the most dense, the most rugged, and the hard, clumpy ones. The potter is not looking for smooth clay. He's not looking for the clay that's all together. He's not looking for the clay that is easy to work with. It's not Play-Doh. It's clay. He takes the clay. He holds the clay in his hands. And again, we're talking from the subject, whose hands are you in? He takes this clay and he feels the lumps, he feels the weight, the density of it, and he realizes, he scoops some more. Takes it, feels it. This is dense. This is hard. He recognizes, based upon the density of the clay and the weight of the clay, it requires more work than he would probably feel comfortable with doing, but because he's committed to the process, he recognizes what the end result needs to be. Therefore, I want to work on the hardest piece of clay that I have. Takes him through this process of the clay selection. When he has identified this clay, he looks at it and says, this is exactly what I want to use. Now, from the very beginning, just like Jeremiah 29:11, God says, I have plans for you, plans to give you hope, peace, and an expected end. The potter, though he has lumpy clay in his hands, that's not what he sees. He's not staring at the original state. He's focusing on, when he looks at it, what he's focusing on is the expected end. So what he's thinking about in his mind, what has to happen in this process to get it to where I need it to be? It's heavy. It's clumpy. It's lumps in it. It may be some rocks. There still may be some debris lodged in it. There's some things that is attached to this clay that should not be there. There's some foreign entities that has connected itself to this clay that he's going to have to work out of this clay in order to get it to where he sees in his mind. He's not focusing on the original state. He's thinking about the end, the expected end for this piece of clay. Once Jeremiah sees that in his hand he has clay, the potter sees, I got a vase. He takes this, goes through the second process, which is called wedging. Second process, wedging. Wedging. He takes the clay. Wedging is when you can use the clay, keep it wet, but you're smoothing your fingers through it to identify if there's any bubbles in the clay. And if there's a bubble, it signifies that there is air in there. So you want to get all of the air out of the clay. Because what happens is once you start to shape it and form it, what happens is that bubble eventually is going to pop, or it'll leave a hole or a gap on the inside of the vessel that you created. It'll leave a gap. And I don't want to leave any gaps. So there's something on the inside of this clay that he is still holding on to. It is my process to identify what is there that he's still holding on to and help smooth out the areas that he don't want to let go of. So what he does is he smooths it to his hand. It's even just running through his hand. He smooths it out. He even goes as far as putting it on the ground and standing on it and stepping on it, standing on it and stepping on it, smoothing it out as much as possible. Amounts of pressure. It's a part of the process. Unfortunately, the clay has no idea what the expected end is. All the clay knows is, I'm supposed to be in your hands. All I know is you said you was going to make something beautiful out of me, and actually I'm being abused through the process. Through this process, things are being moved out of my life. You're squishing me through this process. I feel amounts of pressure through this process. You told me that I was going to come out looking beautiful. Everybody's going to want me. I will be valuable. But all I feel is pressure through this process. Has anybody been through this process of life that you feel like you've been going through pressure? Some stuff we go through just don't make any kind of sense. I thought things were going to get better. I thought if I give my life to God, I'm putting my life in his hands. Why should I feel pressure if I'm in the hands of God? But there's apparently a process where he's moving things out of my entity that needs to be released. Right? So he's moving through the process of wedging. So after he goes through the process of wedging, he takes us through this third process, which is called throwing. He takes it, wets it again, puts it in the water, pulls it out, make sure it's nice and muddy. And there is, in the center of the room, there is his wheel. There is his wheel. The potter always makes sure that he puts the clay in the center of his wheel. Right? The potter wants to ensure that he don't puts it on the edge or the outside, but he wants to make sure that he puts you in the center of his wheel. So the process of the throwing is to make sure you pack it really push pressure, pushing some things down. Because he realizes there's a whole other process that I'm going to have to take it to, that if I just let it sit there without putting any pressure on it to go down, it's going to fly off. So what I do is he takes it and he puts it down, not on the edge, but in the center of his will. See, here's something I want you to keep in mind. Some people think that if I'm in the will of God, I shouldn't have any problems. Right. If I'm in the center of God's will, I shouldn't feel any pressure. If I'm in the center of his, everything should be right for me if I'm in the center of God's will. If that was the case, why did Jesus go through what he went through? I mean, he was in the center of God's will. Okay, so he's in the center of God's will, and he's pushing the clay down so that it doesn't move. He doesn't want the clay to be elevated at this point. He wants it low. Some things you thought you was going to be elevated in. No, it's not the time. Some areas in life you kind of had to take a step back in. And you complained about it, you cried about it, but not realizing that the potter just wanted to make sure you were in the center of the wheel. So he's pushing on it. Now he starts the process where he begins to spin it. There's this wheel, and there is a pump underneath. And the potter begins to pump the wheel. But the clay ain't spinning off. It ain't flying off because it's been compacted in the center of the wheel. But here's the confusing part. Because when I thought that the process was about to end, he was just getting started. Because in this stage, everything is spinning out of control. See, I'm thinking that if I'm in the center of God's will, things should be all right. But he has an end result in mind. Now the potter is so brilliant that he is pumping the wheel and it spins. But the wheel only spins in concordance to the pace of the potter. So depending on what's happening around me, that is determined by how fast and how slow the potter wants it to be. So when things feel like it's spinning out of control real fast, it's based upon the control of the potter. Though it may not make sense to the clay. The potter is very clear about what is happening. He ain't gonna go too fast in the beginning because he know it may fly off. He ain't gonna just out the gate just go real fast. You know what I'm saying? Like, he ain't gonna do that. He ain't gonna do that. He pumping. He keeping a nice pace. He keeping a nice pace. And here's the process with the clay. The process is difficult because the clay can't get a moment to focus. Because everything around it shows no stability. Everything is just constantly moving. And in this process, everything changes. The scenery changes. People come in your life and they're gone. It's a cycle. It's a cycle. So for the clay, you go through this process while you spin it. People come in and they go out. People make promises and they're gone. People have commitments and they don't hold it. I mean, everything. And it seems the only thing that's consistent, that there is no control. Just change. Change. And so in this process now, if you're writing this down, in the throwing process, he starts using this technique where he puts his hands on it and just starts gently smoothing it based upon his pace. But in this process of the potter using two things, being conscious of the pace, he's also trying to determine whether or not if this clay is pliable. Can it be shaped? This is hand in water, puts it on. The more water he puts on the clay, the easier it is to shape it. The less water it has in the process when things are spinning out of control, the harder it gets. The harder it is to be able to give it direction and shape. Here's something interesting. Ephesians says in 5 that God is constantly looking to shape us through the water, or cleanse us or wash us through the water of his word. So just as God uses the water of the word to wash us, the potter uses water to keep us wet for the purpose of shaping our lives, to keep us pliable in this process. The more I stay wet, the more he keeps his hands on me, the more he can shape me and bend me. Yes, I used to have an attitude problem, but the more I get in the word, the more he begins to change the way I see things. The more I stay in his word, I may cuss, but I won't cuss you out as fast as I used to. I'm not doing as much as I used to. I may be mad in traffic, but I ain't going off like I used to. I don't abuse the steering wheel anymore. You know what I'm saying? But that's the more word you get, the more he's able to shape you. The better he can shape you. The less word you get or less water, the harder you will get through the process, and you become more cynical. Well, I got to keep going through this. Everything look the same. If it ain't one thing, it's another. I keep going through the same old thing. I keep going through the same old thing. I keep going through the same old thing. You on the wheel. But it's a part of the process. I'm supposed to go through the same thing over and over. It's a part of the process. Part of the process. So let me move along. So is he shaping it? He's pumping it. Then there's the altering process. He takes a carving knife or utensil, and as it's spinning, he just lightly, as he's pumping it, lightly, with the veracity of the speed, and the dynamics, aerodynamics, he just lightly takes a sharp object to start cutting pieces of the clay that is unnecessary. Parts that we thought we needed. Attachments we thought we had to have. The carving knife starts eliminating pieces from the clay that don't need to be there. And a part of the process in life, I don't have as many friends as I used to that I did when I was in high school. It's carving. Not because they were bad people, not because I became better than them, But some people were just removed. It's a part of the process. Some things have to go. Certain things you used to do, you don't do it as much. Not because you just bet it in there. It's part of the process. Some things just start to get cut. The next part of that process is the bisking process. Bisking process is when you've shaped it, you got it to where you need it to be. He takes it and he sits it right in the sun. He sits it right in the sun. Because as long as this vessel that he's shaped can get some light from the sun, I got to put it in alignment to the sun. It's one thing to have him in the center of my will, but I also got to make sure he gets some light from the sun. And in this process, it begins to not harden it, but it starts to bring some things together. Then it takes it through the glazing process. It's where it takes a simple coating and it begins to paint it on the outside. The coating brings it together. It's almost kind of like when you're cooking. You know how sometimes when you use egg yolk for a meatloaf, right? You'll never see no scrambled eggs in your meatloaf, but you use the egg white, right, as a coating to kind of keep some things together so it don't fall apart. I don't care how good your meatloaf is. If you don't have an ingredient to keep some things together, I don't care how good it is, some things going to fall apart. And so a part of this process that he is watching with the potter is that he's putting a coat on it. The coat gives it its texture. The coating of it gives it its brilliance and its shape, and it keeps things together. Even when it feels like internally, on the inside of my vase, it's still moist, and I feel like I'm still soft. This keeps me from falling apart. So then it goes through from that biscuing process, from the glazing process, and then lastly, it takes it through the fire process. The fire process. It has its shape, it has been coated, but it's thinking in this process, we done. No. The potter then creates a fire in the furnace. Extremely hot. Hotter than the process it was going to receive being in the sun. Because on the outside, the clay looks like, and the vessel looks like it has all its stuff together. But the potter recognizes internally, inward, there's some still stuff on the inside that's still moist, that is not held together. And so if it's mishandled or in the wrong hands, it can be crushed because the inside ain't been dealt with yet. So it takes it through this process of putting it in the fire, intensifying the heat. The heat doesn't destroy the vessel, it fortifies it. So the very things that you have been complaining about is the very thing he uses to fortify you. The very thing you've been praying to get out of is the very thing that he's been trying to fortify you while you in it. The same stuff that you say, I don't want this no more, move this out of my life. He's saying it's a part of the I've been trying to use this to make you better. See, we think through our humanity, it is our desire to live life pain-free. That's not the will of God. And somehow we thought that if I gave my life to Christ, that everything would be better. And it is better. But it doesn't mean I won't go through pain. But even if I go through pain, he still fortifies me and gives me strength, even in the midst of me having pain. I can have pain, but also still walk in strength. And so in those moments, we lose sight of that. And this is why it's really important to really raise the question, whose hands are you in? And the reason some things have fell apart for us, even when it was spinning out of control, is because I've been trying to make life about me and take the things of my life and put them in my hands rather than putting my life in his hands. Amen. So the question to you is, whose hands are you in? Are you still in your own hands? or are you in his hands? It's a change that occurs when I put my life in his hands. The dynamics of what I'm experiencing, it changes when I put my life in his hands or his power.